If you were a 20-year-old German in 1939, you had two choices. You could join the army and freeze to death in Russia, or you could join the submarine force and become part of the elite. Nazi propaganda painted the U-boat crews as knights of the sea. They wore leather jackets, earned double pay, and enjoyed champagne and women in the bars of Paris. They were called the Grey Wolves. But what the recruitment posters didn't mention was this number: 75%. During World War II, about 40,000 sailors boarded German U-boats. Of those, 30,000 never came back. It was the highest casualty rate of any branch of a nation in the entire war. This meant that once you stepped through that 20-inch circular hatch, you had essentially signed your own death warrant. When a depth charge crushed your hull in the deep Atlantic, there would be no grave. Your body would be instantly crushed into pulp, along with this steel machine worth millions of marks. The German sailors whispered a more accurate name for their vessels. Not Grey Wolves, but the Iron Coffins. Today, we take you 200 meters underwater to experience the most claustrophobic, neurotic, and terrifying 15 minutes in the history of warfare. Welcome to the U-boat. First, let's look at your home. The workhorse of the German fleet was the Type VII. It was 67 meters long and less than 6 meters wide. In movies, submarine interiors look spacious and dramatically lit with red light. In reality, they were cramped tubes designed by engineers to house machinery. Humans were just biological components squeezed into the gaps. Inside this narrow steel pipe, they packed two massive diesel engines, 2 electric motors, tons of battery cells, 14 deadly torpedoes, and 50 grown men. There was no privacy. There was no dignity. Because space was so tight, there weren't enough beds. This led to a system called hot bunking. 3 men shared 2 bunks. When you finished a 4-hour shift, exhausted and dripping with sweat, you had to crawl into a bed that was still warm and smelling of the man who had just climbed out. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the smell. Once a U-boat left port, it would stay on patrol for 6 to 8 weeks. Fresh water was precious. It was for drinking only, never for bathing. Imagine the air, a thick soup of 50 men's body odor, unwashed clothes, diesel fumes, moldy bread, and rotting lemons stored to prevent scurvy. And then there were the toilets. A boat carrying 50 men usually had only 2 toilets. And for the first half of the mission, one of them was used as a storage pantry for food cans. So, 50 men shared 1 toilet. Using the head in rough seas was an acrobatic feat. But deep underwater, it was a death trap. You had to operate a complex series of valves to balance the pressure before flushing. If you got the order wrong, which often happened to rookies, the high pressure sea would blast the contents of the bowl right back into your face, covering the compartment in filth. In the U-boat service, they called this the U-boat baptism. If it happened to you, you would never forget that smell. Many people mistakenly believe that World War II submarines could stay underwater indefinitely. That is wrong. Technically, a U-boat was not a submarine. It was a surface torpedo boat that could submerge for short periods. The Type VII had 2 hearts. On the surface, it ran on diesel, engines fast, long range, and loud. But diesels need air. Once submerged, the boat had to switch to electric motors. Electric motors were silent and consumed no oxygen, but their power was extremely limited. Underwater, a U-boat could only crawl at about 4 knots walking speed. If it ran at full speed, the batteries would die in less than an hour. So, U-boats spent 90% of their time on the surface. They only dove to attack or to hide. This limitation created their signature tactic. The Wolf Admiral Karl Dönitz invented a radio-coordinated strategy. When one submarine spotted an Allied convoy, it wouldn't attack alone. Instead, like a wolf howling, it would signal all U-boats within hundreds of miles together. At night, this pack of Grey Wolves would surface. Using their diesel engines for speed and the darkness for cover, they would charge right into the center of the convoy. This was known as the happy time. For Allied merchant sailors, it was pure terror. You were sailing in the pitch-black ocean, and suddenly, a tanker next to you would erupt into a massive fireball. Seconds later, another ship was hit. You couldn't see the enemy. Radar couldn't pick them up because they were so low in the water. Sonar couldn't hear them because the surface noise masked them. Legendary ace Otto Kretschmer even pioneered the tactic of one torpedo, one ship. He would boldly steer his U-boat inside the convoy columns, firing at point-blank range like he was at a shooting gallery. In 1940, these young Germans felt invincible. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and America entered the war. Hitler immediately declared war on the U.S. For the U-boat force, this was a gift. They, Nietzsche, launched Operation Drumbeat, sending long-run U-boats across the Atlantic to the American East Coast. When the German captains arrived off New York and North Carolina, they couldn't believe their eyes. The Americans were completely unprepared. The coastal cities kept their lights on all night. Lighthouses were functioning. Merchant ships sailed with their navigation lights burning bright, without escorts. For the U-boat commanders, it was like a shooting gallery. They could look through their periscopes and see the Ferris wheel lights of Coney Island, then turn around and leisurely sink a fully loaded tanker. In those few months, U-boats sank nearly 400 ships right on America's doorstep. Beaches were frequently washed with oil and charred bodies. It was the U-boat force's last great party. To support this slaughter, the Germans even invented milk cows Type 14 supply submarines. They carried no torpedoes, only fuel and bread, meeting combat boats in the middle of the ocean to extend their range. But their luck was about to run out. By 1943, the tide turned, not because the Allies became braver, but because technology evolved. First, radar. Allied planes were equipped with small microwave radars that could detect a U-boat's periscope from miles away. Second, the Lee light, a powerful searchlight mounted on bombers. Once radar locked onto a submarine at night, the plane would swoop in and switch on the blinding light at the last second. German sailors would be blinded, followed instantly by depth charges and machine gun fire. And the deadliest secret of all Enigma was broken. British codebreakers, led by Alan Turing, had cracked the German naval codes. Every time Donitz radioed a wolf pack to gather, the Allies heard it. Convoys were routed around the traps, or hunter-killer groups were sent to ambush the U. And with the arrival of escort carriers, the air gap in the mid-Atlantic was closed. There was no longer anywhere safe to surface and recharge batteries. The U-boat went from hunter to hunted. When a destroyer spotted a U-boat, the real hell began. There was only one choice. Alarm. Crash dive. Sirens wailed. The crew would jump out of their bunks and sprint to the bow room, using their body weight to tip the boat down faster. Diesels off. Electric motors on. The boat slid into the silent darkness. Now, a terrifying game began. The game was called silence. Underwater, sound is death. If a mechanic dropped a wrench, the sound wave would travel 4 miles to the hydrophones of the destroyer above. So, everyone took off their shoes. No talking, no moving. You even had to control your breathing. You sat in the dark, bathed in red emergency light, listening to the sound of propellers above. Thump! 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 The sound got louder, passed directly overhead, and then faded. You thought you were safe? No. The destroyer was just calculating your lead. Then, the splash depth charges. Time underwater moves slowly. You knew the barrels were sinking. You were waiting for the click. Click. The detonator triggers. And then boom. It wasn't just a noise. Underwater, the shockwave hit the hull like a giant sledgehammer. The whole boat was kicked sideways. Light bulbs shattered. Glass gauges exploded. Pipes burst. You were thrown against the wall, eardrums ringing. But you couldn't scream. You could only stare in terror at the rivets on the ceiling. Under the immense pressure, those rivets groaned and squealed, threatening to pop out like bullets at any second. This psychological torture could last for hours, sometimes days. Some young sailors would crack. They would start screaming or sobbing. In those moments, the veterans wouldn't hesitate. They would knock the kid unconscious and tie him to his bunk, or inject him with sedatives, because one man's scream could kill the whole crew. If the depth charge didn't kill you, it might force you into the abyss. To evade the explosions, the captain would order, "Dive. Deeper. 150 meters. 180 meters. 200 meters. For every 10 meters you descended, the pressure on the hull increased by 1 atmosphere. You could hear the steel plates groaning the sound of metal, struggling against physics. Every submarine has a theoretical limit called crust depth. Go beyond it, and the ocean will crush the hull like an eggshell. But in a life or death chase, you had to gamble. You gambled that German engineering held up. You gambled that the designer left a margin of error. Sometimes, you won the bet. But mostly, it was a tragedy. If the hull cracked, high-pressure water would jet in like a laser, capable of cutting a man in half. Even worse, if seawater hit the battery banks, it created a chemical reaction that released chlorine gas. It was a heavy, yellow-green gas. One breath would burn your throat and turn your lungs to liquid. Trapped deep underwater, the crew faced the cruelest choice. Blow the tanks and surface into machine gun fire, or stay down and suffocate, or open the sea valves and let the ocean crush you instantly. Whatever the choice, it was a horrible way to die. By 1944, the U-boat force was broken. German engineers tried to save the situation. They invented the snorkel, a breathing tube that allowed boats to run diesels while submerged. They even built the futuristic Type 21, the first true electric submarine. But it was too late. Allied air power covered every inch of the ocean. U-boats were sunk as soon as they left port. During Black May, 41 U-boats were lost in a single month. Desperate, the Navy began sending 18-year-old boys to the front. Their training was cut from months to weeks. Many of them didn't even know how to reload a torpedo before they died on their first patrol. The final radio messages from these boats were often the same. Surrounded. Diving. Long live the commander. And then eternal silence. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. Admiral Dönitz issued his final order. Operation Rainbow. He ordered all surviving U-boats to scuttle themselves rather than surrender. Crews wept as they opened the valves and watched their boats sink to the bottom. Today, at the bottom of the Atlantic, lie the wrecks of over 700 German U-boats. Some are broken in half. Some are flattened like pancakes. Inside those rusting hulls, the remains of those young men are still entombed. They are still wearing their leather jackets, still wearing their headsets, sitting at their rusted stations. They were fighting for an evil regime, but they were also humans who endured a level of fear that we can barely imagine. When we look at the ocean today, it is hard to picture the desperate life and death struggles that happened beneath the calm waves. That is the deep sea, a place where sunlight never reaches. The eternal resting place of 30,000 souls. There remain the iron coffins. If you enjoyed this story of deep sea terror, please like and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next video.